Good morning, everybody. Welcome to what is one of our first webinars for the year. Today, we are talking about adopting a privacy by design approach. We're joined by Nicole Stephensen from IIS Partners. Before we begin today, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. I extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people here today. In a few seconds, I'll hand over to Nicole. I'll mute myself and turn off my video so she can jump into this topic. And please feel free to use the chat section. We'll keep a bit of time at the end of the session to dive into any questions that you might have. So for now, I'll hand over to you, Nicole. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Robin. Hello, everyone. I'm Nicole Stephensen. I'm a partner with IIS Partners, and I am our privacy program management and acculturation specialist. I'm delighted to be here with all of you today for a couple of reasons. First, it's wonderful on the heels of Smart Cities Week, which I was unable to attend this year, to be able to kind of do a little bit of a privacy wrap up, right? At Smart Cities Week, we often talk about all the wonderful opportunities that we have with digital and data and transformation initiatives. And we do talk about cybersecurity, but often privacy and the protection of personal information gets shelved. So this is a really wonderful opportunity to sort of draw a lovely circle around all those things from a privacy perspective. The second is that the Federal Attorney General of Australia has now released the report into the Privacy Act review. I'm a privacy geek, so I've been waiting for this. I'm sure that some of you may not even know that that's been happening, but there's been a fairly substantial review in Australia about our privacy legislation, what it covers, what it doesn't cover, how to strengthen it, and how to improve enforcement of it. Now, that report has been released, and so in the context of today's discussion, in terms of adopting a privacy by design approach, talking about privacy strategy and some of the things that you can do to bolster your privacy posture, it's really good timing, right? So in addition to watching today's webinar, which has happened really auspiciously, please do take the time to check out the Federal Attorney General's report into privacy, and I'll make sure that we get that link out to you after today's webinar, along with the slides from the presentation today. So I'm going to be talking about a couple of things today, and I want to do them in sequential order for those of you who are kind of new to the game. If privacy is not something that you talk about or deal with regularly, I want to make sure that you have that sort of foundational understanding of privacy, personal information, and why these things are important. Then I'd like to talk about privacy by design, and why this kind of an approach is important, and how do we get there as councils or as vendors that are supporting those councils. And then finally, privacy strategy. In order to embed a privacy by design approach across our organization, in this case, councils or vendors that are supporting those councils or others that are part of the Smart Cities ecosystem, we have to talk strategy first. So understanding privacy, what is it and why is it important? Well, this is like the central question for privacy professionals. This is what we get asked the most. What is it? Tell me what privacy is, where it sits with me, how I can understand and digest and unpack it. But what's interesting is that anytime you ask someone what privacy is, whether they're within a business or an organization, or they're even in the privacy space, in cybersecurity, or in some other part of the community, the answer to what is privacy is always different. And what I find is that folks tend to be able to unpack privacy better if they look at it in terms of its component parts and the bits and pieces of that mean the most to them. What happens, though, is that depending on what means the most to you in your particular context, your threshold in relation to what privacy is going to be different. So often we talk about privacy in terms of my space that I occupy, right? My personal bubble. We think of this in sort of our territorial terms associated with the houses that we live in, or the elevator that we're riding in, the car that we're driving in. And it's that idea that while I'm alone in my personal space with myself, I have the the belief, the reasonable belief that I should not be observed in an unnecessary way or unreasonably intruded upon in my solitude. We also think about privacy in terms of our health and well-being and our bodies. So when I talk about privacy in that context, we're thinking about things like, am I well today? Do I feel well today? Am I happy? Am I sad? What things about me might my blood reveal or my DNA reveal? Do I have any diseases? Do we have any history in our family of particular diseases or concerns health-wise? Health privacy encapsulates all of that stuff, our continuing care and treatment in a health context. We also have communications privacy, which is about what we choose to communicate, to whom, using what medium, and the reasonable belief that whatever we're communicating is going to get from point A to point B uninterrupted and not viewed by someone else. Part of all of that is the idea of something called information privacy, the information about you and about me in whatever context we're operating in that identifies us or could lead to us being identified. And information privacy tends to be the thing that resonates most in terms of privacy laws worldwide, because it's a little bit more concrete, and it tends to be less embedded with those sort of civil liberties type concepts like my right to be left alone or my right to be free from intrusion into my personal life, and put into a form that we can see and understand more readily. Now, what's interesting is that because everybody's kind of benchmark or threshold in relation to privacy and what it means to them can be different, we have laws that help us understand and manage community expectations in a consistent and replicable way. Now, when I talk about community expectations, I'm talking about those expectations in relation to information privacy, right? The information about you and about me. And there are a number of privacy laws that are going to be relevant to those in the room. Today, we have, of course, our federal privacy law that is the subject of this massive review. We also have state and territory privacy laws, such as the privacy law we have here in my state of Queensland. And then we have other laws that deal with personal information in a context, right? So perhaps there are surveillance laws or child safety laws or education laws or health laws that deal with privacy in a context. We have international laws, and some of you might be familiar with, the big ticket ones of those, like the European Union's GDPR. And then we have standards and frameworks and guidelines and best practices. Again, some of you might be familiar with some of those, such as the International Standards Organization standards, like ISO 27001, which deals with information security, or the NIST cybersecurity and privacy frameworks. So you may be across some or all or none of those. But what I'm here to say today is that there are laws in place in Australia, in this region, in the Australia-New Zealand region, that deal with the collection and handling of personal information in a consistent way. And for you who are part of local governments or you are vendors to local governments, chances are you're going to be caught in some way by those laws. So our local governments here in Australia, for example, are required to follow the privacy rules of the state that they are in. So here in my state of Queensland, local governments are required to comply with the Information Privacy Act of 2009. And what we also have are vendor requirements associated with that, where if you are a vendor to a Queensland local council and you are managing personal information on behalf of that council is required to bind you to the privacy principles in the state of Queensland to make sure that when you're acting as though you are them, that you are doing the right thing with personal information in terms of its collection and management. So as I've been alluding to all along, this is about personal information. It's not about all the data in a smart cities or a local government context. It's about the personal stuff, the stuff about you and about me. Now, what's really interesting in terms of the way that most privacy laws worldwide work is that they are about a natural or living person, so someone who is alive. Also, they're technology neutral and they're not medium specific. So when we think about personal information, it is not about how it is gathered or what medium, but it's actually about the fact of it being personal information or not. Does it identify a person? Could it lead to them being identified? As opposed to, did it come through some sort of technical gateway? Does it sit on a computer? Does it sit in a database? Does it sit on a form or in a box? That's actually irrelevant in terms of the definition of personal information. Now, when it comes to personal information in a local government or city's context, it's actually about much more than you would think. And I had the opportunity to do some wonderful work for the Office of the Queensland Information Commissioner recently, where we unpacked what personal information might look like in a council context or a city's context. And we broke it down into a way that might be digestible, not just for the community, but also for vendors or local governments that are in that position of ingesting and managing lots and lots of personal information, whether it's for their technology initiatives or their data initiatives, or just in terms of general service delivery to the community. And there are that many categories and types of personal information that are involved that I really would encourage you, if you're not already across this, to go and have a look at the Office of the Information Commissioner of Queensland's website and have a look at their local government toolkit, because there is this great printable poster actually that's available that talks about what personal information might be in your context. Now, all of this leads us to, I guess, the critical point of this part of the discussion, which is that privacy is important. So councils and the technology and other vendors that support them require significant amounts of personal information to do their job, right? And we're handling this type of information on a daily basis, or the machines we've built or the technologies that we've deployed are handling that information. They're managing it and they're moving it around in some way. Now, there is an increasing degree of community awareness and concern in relation to privacy. So we only have to look at some of the things that are happening in the news at the moment in terms of local council technology deployments. Now, whether that's of, say, smart CCTV cameras or RFID tags on council assets or smart parking or a variety of different initiatives, these things can cause the community concern unless they're aware of what happens to their personal information and why. So there is a real need to, instead of allowing the community to fill in their own gaps in relation to privacy and turn to their fears or their concerns and make that their reality, it's really important to be communicating about privacy and being clear about what's happening. Community trust is vital, right? That's what councils rely on in terms of, I guess, their social license to operate. The challenge here, though, is that members of the community rarely have the option in a city context to opt out and go somewhere else, right? I don't know about you, but there is no way that if I was annoyed with what my city council was doing, that I could just pick up and move to a new city and start over again with somebody that I thought had better privacy practices. That's rarely going to be an option for the community. So do keep this in mind in terms of who you are serving and how much they're relying on you to protect personal information in whatever the context is. Now, we do have a complex regulatory environment that I alluded to before. So privacy is not just important in terms of that managing community expectations when delivering services or promoting new technologies. It's also about making sure that you've got a finger on the pulse in terms of what rules apply to you so that from a risk perspective, you're not facing undue compliance risk or undue regulatory scrutiny. And then finally, there is a significant increase in the use of technology and big data in our council initiatives, right? Smart cities they're predicated on the leveraging of technology for social good, right? We leverage technology to make life faster, smarter, easier, more equitable. Well, while we are doing that, we need to think about what happens to the information of the people that we serve, because it's usually that information that's being leveraged most by those technologies. So now I'd like to talk a little bit about privacy by design, what it is, why it's important, and how do we get there. So privacy by design is a best practice approach. And look, best practice is one of those sort of fluffy terms, right? Where we think, look, we could take it or leave it. The reality is, though, when I say best practice, what I mean is if you follow this approach, you are increasing your likelihood of being able to comply with the law and community expectations. So privacy by design is a best practice approach where privacy is designed into our policies and our procedures and our processes and our projects and our initiatives, our products, our services, our technologies, all of it, as opposed to being bolted on later. Now, if you think about what it means to retrofit a consideration as big as privacy, that can be quite damaging. Whereas building something like privacy in from the outset, it opens up opportunities in terms of compliance, meeting community expectations, bolstering trust, etc. But what do I mean when I say privacy by design? What does it look like? Well, it's a little bit, so there's this analogy that gets used in privacy circles a lot. We talk about privacy by design like a layer cake or some kind of complex recipe. Now, the thing though about having a recipe is that if you miss one or two of the ingredients, the chances are you're going to have a flop, right? As opposed to some kind of success in your kitchen. So keep this in mind when you're thinking about the collection of privacy by design principles that I'm introducing to you today, or that you might have been introduced to before. So privacy by design is founded on 7 principles, and these are intended to be taken together as part of your organizational ethos. So for a city, the idea is that privacy becomes just what we do here. It's part of us. It's part of our DNA, our ethos. And the ways that we determine whether it's part of our ethos are measured in relation to these 7 principles. Now, the challenge, though, is that when the privacy by design principles were first coined back in the late 1990s by a wonderful person called Dr. Ann Kabuki, and she's pretty much the truest guru in terms of privacy internationally, right? She came up with this and determined that this really is the way to ensure that privacy becomes just what we do here. The challenge, though, that when you look at these things from a philosophical perspective is you might have all the ingredients, but what if your recipe book doesn't tell you which ingredients to put first into the mixing bowl? This is the challenge with privacy by design, is that we know when all these principles are taken together, they work wonderfully and you have a really good result. But there is still a lot of conjecture and decision-making that's sort of associated with which comes first and why and how. And a wonderful colleague of mine named Jason Cronk, who some of you might be familiar with, wrote a book called Strategic Privacy by Design, and that's now a textbook for the International Association of Privacy Professionals in one of their certification programs. And what Jason did in that book was that he took these privacy by design principles and tried to find a way to have them materialize in an ordinary organizational context. So as opposed to them being sort of your philosophical best practice idea, they could be turned into something actionable that could be done on a day-to-day basis within organizations when they're making decisions, whether that's about technology or creating a new bylaw, or something as simple as having a community-related survey or some kind of campaign. How do we build privacy by design in? And strategic privacy by design, that book, is something that I would definitely recommend for your library if you don't have it already. And I'll make sure that Robin makes the link to that available as well after today's discussion. So the point about the principles, though, is this, that principle-based decision-making provides for us this kind of essential scaffolding, right? These guardrails, so that when we're making decisions in relation to the collection and management of personal information for our technologies, for our initiatives, for our policies, for our processes, if we have these principles in mind, if we let these principles guide us, we are much more likely to be able to do so in compliance with privacy rules and in meeting with community expectations. So one of the areas that I think is really important when it comes to privacy by design is the idea that we can use it to support innovative thinking, right? Where our privacy risks are removed or mitigated at the outset. I see this a lot in a smart cities context, or this opportunity a lot. I don't often see this opportunity materialize well, but I do see the opportunity there for the taking. So one example is, the Sidewalk Labs initiative that was in place in Toronto for some years. And for those of you who are not familiar with that, although I hope most of you are, there was a public-private partnership that was proposed by Waterfront Toronto, involving themselves and the parent company of Google, which is Alphabet. And the whole idea was to create a smart precinct and really support community development and community evolution through smart technologies, right? So really strong public purpose. But where they fell down was that aspects of privacy by design were not well met. And even though there were efforts in that space, there were some conflicts in terms of, well, are we being transparent enough? Does the community really know what's going to happen to their personal information through its life cycle? Are we really preventing the on-selling of personal information into a data broking environment? Questions like that were being raised. Now, unfortunately, at the time that Sidewalk Labs occurred, there was a lot of fear and conjecture in the community. And to the point that I made earlier about the importance of privacy and how it's important that we fill in the gaps for the community and we ensure that the community really understands what's going to happen to their personal information and why. And in addition to us also being allowed or able to do that kind of thing under the law. If we're not doing that, the community will fill in the gaps for themselves. And whether the risk is real or perceived, that risk may in fact derail a project, which is what happened in the case of Sidewalk Labs. Now, I have, though, seen some really great examples, such as the City of Melbourne through their digital urban infrastructure area. They have sort of technology test beds or projects where they're wanting to leverage technology to the benefit of the community. And they have a wonderful co-design approach that's associated with that. So I guess the way of summarizing it is the idea that there's nothing about me without me that happens in terms of, digital urban infrastructure testing in the City of Melbourne. What underpins that, though, and some of you may not know this, is that the City of Melbourne has a privacy by design framework that they use in order to build out any of their technology projects. And there's a particular series of steps and processes that they must go through before these types of technologies are brought out into the community. They are using privacy by design to support their thinking. So they've got an innovative idea, they've got a technology. They're wanting to make sure that first, before they start gathering the personal information, before they start learning from it or making decisions in relation to it, they want to make sure that those privacy boxes are ticked and in a way that is meaningful for the community. So I definitely commend the City of Melbourne to all of you as a potential learning opportunity there for you in terms of your innovations and your technology projects. Similarly, we have the City of Darwin. Now, back in the day, the City of Darwin was, in a really challenging position. They were in the media a lot because they had rolled out a smart CCTV network for a strong public purpose, but the community didn't really understand what that purpose is and what the limits on that were. So what ended up happening was that the city was pilloried in the media. They were accused of, creating a quasi-surveillance state, and that required a lot of, privacy backpedaling. And the city did a remarkable job of turning that dialogue around and being able to communicate widely that while they were using smart technologies in one context, no, they didn't have any intention of using facial recognition technology for the surveillance type initiatives that the community was worried about. They put that in writing. They put that loudly in writing and work to this day in relation to a dedicated privacy management plan so that they continue to meet the expectations of their community. Again, privacy by design can support that innovative thinking where you start thinking about privacy at the outset as opposed to bolting it on later. Now, when it comes to privacy strategy, and this is probably my favorite topic, it's about how do you get from this idea, this pie in the sky idea about privacy by design, and how do you put it into action within your council or even within your business or your organization if you support councils, smart cities in some ways, right? So perhaps you're a large telco, perhaps you are a provider of various different information management services or infrastructure services. Whatever it is that you do, you have an opportunity to implement privacy strategy and get folks thinking about privacy just as part of what we do here. So as opposed to it being seen as a compliance burden or an issue or a challenge or too hard basket, it just becomes part of, your everyday ethos as an organization. Now, the premise of privacy strategy is this, that good decisions happen when we have strong foundations in relation to privacy and the management of personal information, right? There are less mistakes when it comes to privacy and the management of personal information if we have strong foundations underpinning us. So I'm actually here to highlight that many of you might think you have the basics, but I would suggest possibly you don't. So most of the time when cities or even vendors that support them come to me and are seeking advice in relation to privacy, they ask me, can you help us create a privacy policy? Now it's a really important question and a really good question and an accountable question to be asked. But it's not the first question to be asked, because as you'll see, as we go through this discussion about strategy, a privacy policy is actually something that happens further down the track. A privacy policy should be something that is responsive to your privacy strategy. It's responsive to what you think and feel about privacy and how it needs to work for you in your council or in your other organization that's supporting a smart cities initiative. So what we see is that a strategic presence is the first cab off the rank, the first stepping stone to the privacy basics that you need to have. From a strategic presence, then you build out your privacy and security management frameworks, your management plans. That's the time after that you ensure that privacy has a seat at the table, that there's someone thinking about privacy in relation to risk management and procurement and project design and deployment, that there is someone to help you conduct privacy impact assessments or other levels of consultation. From there, you have your corporate and service level policies and procedures. And from there, you have your complaints management, right? Your feedback loop. It all starts with strategy. So a way of looking at it is this, right? If you were to draw a box around, say, privacy impact assessments, which is like a risk management tool or a risk assessment tool that some councils or vendors may use, you can see that without having a strategic presence, you're unlikely to have your privacy impact assessment go anywhere. If no one at the executive or board level really cares about privacy, understands its importance for the organization or council, is going to, if those people aren't there, or if those people are there but they don't care about privacy, when they read the privacy impact assessment associated with your technology or your initiative, they're not going to understand what it means and how that corresponds to things like community trust, community expectations, potential regulatory scrutiny. They're not really going to get the full picture. It's important when you think about the basics that you're thinking about two things, right? Often as an organization, we will think about compliance risk, right? We do a lot of navel gazing when it comes to topics like privacy or information security, and we think about compliance. What's our risk of getting a complaint? What's our risk of regulatory scrutiny, right? We don't think about care. We don't think about why it matters to us in terms of the community that we serve or why we're here, right? Cities are public institutions. They are here to serve the community in a particular way. They're not here. Their primary focus is not compliance with the law. Their primary focus is serving the community. So if we think about privacy and privacy strategy that way, it's about imparting our care factor within the organization so that we can uplift our compliance factor later. So to summarize, privacy strategy is intended to influence your culture as a city. It's intended to reinforce that privacy is your ticket to play. And when I say ticket to play, I mean it. I mean that if privacy is not adequately looked at in relation to technology initiatives, and look, there are so many technology initiatives in our cities and our smart cities, right? You think about free urban Wi-Fi, you think about RFID tagging, you think about, you know, the various different digital literacy campaigns that happen in our cities. You think about connectivity, you think about CCTV cameras and, you know, placemaking, all of these different amazing initiatives. If privacy hasn't been considered, should those initiatives be taking off? Should they be taking off without having that sort of essential scaffolding around them? Privacy strategy, it ensures that the topic of privacy and the management of personal information in accordance with community expectations and the law becomes de rigueur. It becomes just what we do here. Privacy becomes treated as an enabler and not a drag on progress. It offers us an opportunity to improve, right? So say we do a privacy risk assessment and we determine that, wow, there's a risk of harm here we hadn't thought of before. It gives us an opportunity to build that risk of harm out of our technology or out of our solution. And it provides a safety net, right? It provides us with a safety net as a city or as a vendor that we have done things right. And it also provides a safety net in terms of, you know, those community expectations. The community feels cared for and taken care of. Sorry, there we are. So look, a strategy doesn't have to look like a strategy, right? So I often talk with cities about the difference between a big S strategy and a small S strategy. And a big S strategy is the kind of strategy that you pay a large consultancy for, and you know, it might be 50 or 100 or 400 pages long, and it'll be glossy and it'll be bound and it will have been very expensive, and it's going to gather dust somewhere in your council library. I'm not necessarily sure that that kind of strategy is the kind of strategy that most cities are going to have an appetite for or an ability to create and implement. So I want to give you an example of a privacy strategy that I think is great. So City of Darwin, you know, on the heels of the negative public sentiment that they experienced in relation to the implementation of their smart CCTV cameras, went about a big program of privacy uplift. And they started with strategy. And they determined what was their mission? You know, what do they care about? What do they want to achieve in terms of privacy? And what were their visions? What does that look like? You know, what are the key benchmarks for having achieved their mission? And then what are the principles that guide them in achieving those two things? That is a small S strategy. That's something you can do on a page. That's something you can print on a poster or put on a dedicated web page or include in your annual report. That is a small S strategy, but I can assure you that can have the same impact internally for your organization and externally in terms of the community that you serve than any sort of glossy big tome that's going to gather dust in a library. So again, I commend to you this as an example of, you know, where you can go with privacy strategy that's meaningful, that takes account of many of those aspects of privacy by design in terms of those privacy by design principles. You can see many of those here echoed in the mission, vision, and guiding principles for City of Darwin. Now, what's important is that, you know, earlier I was talking about by, you know, creating your care factor, then you're also uplifting your ability to comply with privacy rules. I just wanted to sort of give you an analogy that may be helpful in terms of visualizing where privacy strategy sits for you. Now, often when we think of strategy, and fair enough, but often when we think of strategy, we think of it as a top-down exercise, right? We think of it as an umbrella. And yes, while it's top down in the sense of executive approval and executive support, the reality is that privacy strategy is something more like the roots to your tree, right? So if you have strong roots providing the foundation for your privacy tree within your council or even within your vendor environment. So I'm not leaving you guys out, right? I actually think all of you need to think about privacy strategy in this way. You're establishing a care factor as a foundation for your privacy program. From there, you can build out a pretty solid privacy management framework and plan, which almost echoes, say, the more surface level roots or the trunk of your tree. And then from there, you branch off, right, into policies and processes and procedures, and then particular aspects of those like project design and deployment, complaints management, procurement processes, and so forth. So building your privacy strategy then, what do you need to consider when you're doing this? Look, I think it's really important at the outset to think about who your responsible officers are. So who's going to carry the strategy for you? Often cities do not have a dedicated privacy officer, right? Someone who is exclusively responsible for privacy. Now, cities do have legal officers, legal teams, right? Or many of them do. And they do have information technology teams. They do have information security teams. There's all sorts of different places where privacy might sit if it sits anywhere. But often it's sitting at a functional or operational level, not at a place where the individual responsible is actually able to drive strategy and to drive change, particularly in that kind of cultural or care factor way. So it's really about getting your executive on board, right? Often our local governments have executive leadership teams that sit across a wide variety of functions of the council. You know, who within ELT or, you know, which collection of people within ELT or perhaps a separate committee are going to be responsible for building and driving your privacy strategy. Now, from there, what does the mission and vision look like, right? What do you want your strategy to do for your city or for yourself as an organization if you are supporting cities, say, in that sort of smart cities or technology-driven context? What problems do you need to solve with your privacy strategy? Do you have a compliance problem, right? Is your problem about being able to actually do what the privacy rules that apply to you say you have to do? Is that your problem? Or do you have a community trust problem? Do you have a staff awareness problem? What are your problems? And how is that privacy strategy going to help you to minimize or eliminate those problems? What is your big picture plan? That's what a privacy strategy is. It's not getting down into the weeds. It's not about even the types of policies and processes, for example, that you want to write or that you want to embed within your council. The privacy strategy is bigger than that. It's saying who's accountable for privacy in this city and what's our care factor, right? What principles are we following in relation to privacy? What's our mission? What's our vision? What problems are we solving? And what is our strategy going to do about that? What's our strategy going to activate or enable or support within council to see that those problems are solved? Now, often in terms of big picture planning, I like to say that the strategy is the thing that establishes that the city will have a privacy management framework. The strategy establishes that the privacy management framework will also include a privacy management plan, and that there will be responsible people who check to see that that is done. That the strategy enables the city to engage in particular audit or assurance processes in relation to privacy, and makes it really clear from an organizational perspective that this is something that matters here. Also, in relation to your strategy, you really do need to think about timeframes, right? Nobody is going to snap their fingers and have instant privacy in their council or in their vendor environment. That, I mean, it would be nice, right? I would be totally out of work if that happened, by the way, if we could just snap our fingers and ensure that privacy was done. But there is a time frame you need to consider, right? If you have a strategy, but it gets shelved in the library somewhere and gathers dust, it's not being actioned, and no one is responsible for seeing that that gets actioned, you know, within a reasonable period. So set a time frame. Consider, do you think that you could start to turn the ship of privacy culture in your council in a year, 2 years? Maybe it's a 5-year plan. Maybe you've never really considered privacy before. You don't have the staffing or resources in terms of actioning privacy, and you know that. Maybe your strategy is a 5-year plan. Whatever that is in terms of time frame will have to be determined based on you as a council or as a vendor supporting council. It won't be something that you could just choose from a template, right? This would be something you need to discuss internally and see what would work for you in your circumstance. And finally, look, the thing that I think is probably the most important here, and the thing that's always underdone in terms of privacy strategy, is engaging the community that you serve. So, how I was talking earlier about the city of Melbourne and how they have their privacy by design framework that informs their digital urban infrastructure projects. Well, they have an ethos there that of nothing about me without me, right? So if technology projects and data projects are going to involve, harnessing and harvesting the personal information of the community and learning from it and making decisions in relation to that, well, shouldn't the community then be on board? Absolutely, yes. So how do you make the community part of your privacy strategy? Is it going to be important for you to survey the community or to have a town hall meeting and find out what people care about? Often I see people upset in communities in relation to privacy when it comes to surveillance activities, right, of the council, whether it's, say, drone deployments or CCTV deployments or facial recognition deployment. Now, those are some pretty big ticket privacy, risk areas, right? But when you hear from the community about what matters to them, you'll know for sure, that the community is concerned about surveillance. So maybe that's something that you're going to want to build into your strategy in some way. Or maybe the community isn't concerned about surveillance. They're more concerned about just simply not knowing what council does with their personal information. Maybe they're concerned with having a little bit more choice and control. Well, that's something you're only going to find out with community consultation. There's a real sort of resistance in privacy circles to this sort of kind of paternalistic approach of, now, we're your city, we're your council, we know what's best for you. Privacy strategy suggests that you maybe turn that on its head, and instead of assuming you know what's best for people and implementing that or doing that, ask them, because you would probably be quite surprised at what you find. You may find that people want engagement in relation to privacy that looks and feels quite different to what your expectations were. So with that, I can actually conclude my presentation and open up to questions. I think that I've left exactly 15 minutes, as I suggested to Robin that I would. I hope this has been useful for everyone, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Spot on, yeah, exactly 15 minutes to go. Thank you, Nicole. That was really interesting. I particularly like your layer cake approach. I think something we've seen discussed in the industry before, and something I think is going to be key moving forward is the empowerment of employees of cities at all levels, to ensure that leadership signed off on it. But it is an approach and a way of doing things rather than a checkbox at the end. But is there any advice you can give to somebody sort of mid-level that's wanting to implement a privacy by design approach, to empower them to have action taken?
Look, it can be really tricky in cities. And I know that when I do presentations like this, I come across like a real Pollyanna, right? That, oh, everything's going to be fine. If you just do what I say, the world will be sunshiny and everyone will get what they want in terms of privacy. The reality is that there are many different competing objectives in our cities. And there is a massive compliance burden in cities too. So you think about all the various different things that we already have to think of. We have to think about sort of, equitable employment. We have to think about, equal opportunity. We have to think about no bullying and no sexual discrimination and harassment. We have to think about workplace health and safety. We have to think about all the various different compliance obligations that we have, and understand that privacy is another one of those, but it is also, in a way that some of those other things are not, a true opportunity for a city to improve its relationship with the community that it serves and hear the community that it serves and address its concerns. So if you are someone within a city and you have a job description that has privacy in it, you are already ahead of the game, right? Because part of your job relates to the management of personal information in accordance with the law. If nothing else, right? You've got a compliance burden or focus associated with your job. That is enough for you to usually take the typical risk management escalation processes within the context of your council to get in front of someone in the executive leadership team to talk about privacy in a meaningful way. Again, though, that's not always easy because many of these officers are not typically empowered to go from their door into the executive space without a whole bunch of other sort of, climbing the rungs of the ladder quite a lot. And that can be frustrating and disempowering. So what I have found is finding a champion within an area of the city that leverages personal information all the time. And those areas usually relate to either human resources or digital and data. So if you are a person who's concerned about privacy, would like to see it elevated in terms of, profile within your council, perhaps going and talking to someone within human resources or within digital and data to talk about a privacy related project, right? Something that will shed light on privacy and its importance in a context within the city, and then take your learnings from that and report up to the executive and get their buy-in that way. So I think there are plenty of ways to do it. I prefer the direct approach, but I'm really conscious that in our cities right now, privacy tends to be buried and isn't considered as important. Another place you could leverage is information security. So right now we have a lot of concerns in relation to securing our critical infrastructure that cities need to be alive to. And we also have concerns in relation to data breach. And I don't know a single person who hasn't seen all the stuff going on in relation to data breach in the news over the last few months in Australia. Talking to someone in a leadership position within information security and getting privacy brought into the conversation at that level is also an opportunity for you.
So that sort of leads into the next question we have here. My question is, which team should be responsible to run privacy management activities in an organization? Compliance, tech, legal, or directly from the privacy team?
Oh, so look, I'm a privacy purist, right? I think anyone that can handle it in terms of organizational structure, if you're big enough, you should have your own privacy team. You should have a privacy team that calls the shots in relation to that. The reality is, though, unless you're, say, city of Seattle, where you've got your own chief privacy officer who's got, a particular vested function and sits within the C-suite, unless you're that city or a city like that, it's more likely that privacy is going to be aligned to whatever the key strategic objective is of the city at the time. So cities that are particularly concerned with compliance, legal and compliance, they might want to align privacy with legal. That also dovetails nicely into access to information obligations that sit within privacy or freedom of information spaces, right, within our councils. So that might be the place you put privacy there. Or if your strategic objective is more in relation to digital and data, maybe aligning privacy with your innovation and technology stream might be useful. Or, and what I have seen more recently lately is privacy and information security being nested together, which is quite nice, right? Because they're complementary. You you need to have information security in order to give effect to your privacy obligations. So that might also be a nice place to nest. I guess that the short answer to my very long-winded answer is you have to pick what's right for you and take that approach.
Okay, so two other questions. Just from a regulator's privacy complaints perspective, Claire said she can reiterate that letting people know the what, the why, and the how do you find more information about it is critical. I'm sure you can expand more on this.
Yeah, thank you, Claire. Look, the reality is, as I was saying at the beginning, our local governments are required to comply with the privacy rules in the jurisdiction that they're in. So if you're in Victoria, you comply with the state-based privacy legislation in Victoria, similarly in Queensland. There are some states that don't have privacy laws, and I don't want to get into my feelings on that because I think that's really an area where we're lagging behind in Australia. But from a privacy complaints perspective, if there is no vehicle within council for a person to meaningfully complain about privacy, two things happen. One is that the council is unable to know what people are concerned about in terms of their information practice and take action on that. The second is that an individual in the community who has a privacy concern is prevented from seeing their complaint escalate. And this is because most of our privacy laws, before a regulator gets involved, require that a person first complains to the agency that they're concerned about. So if there isn't a vehicle for you to complain to a council and get some kind of a response, sorry about that, just one moment. Oh my gosh, that's so funny, everyone. My husband's just arrived home and didn't realize I was doing a webinar. So I apologize, everyone. That was my little dog, Charlie. Look, the reality is if you don't have that complaints opportunity or mechanism within council, you're preventing the community from giving effect to their own privacy rights. Likewise, you are really putting the regulator in a difficult position of then trying to help that member of the community circle back into the council to get a resolution for their issue.
Okay, and final question we have here, it's anonymous, but what does a privacy impact assessment consist of?
Okay, so a privacy impact assessment is what I like to think of as a due diligence exercise, right? Where you look at an initiative that you have, whether that's creation of a policy or a process or a bylaw, or implementing a new technology, or in some way handling personal information in a new way or a way that the community might not reasonably expect. It's looking at that through a privacy lens. So it's not just about determining whether you can do the activity in compliance with whatever the privacy law is that applies to you. It's also about thinking, well, should we do this activity? Or are there ways we can do this activity that minimize potential harm to the individuals, the community that we serve? So a good example would be, say you were doing a privacy impact assessment you wanted to implement free urban Wi-Fi, right? Most cities are wanting to do this now so that they can encourage people into their central business districts and to use the services of the businesses there, or into their libraries, right? That they spend all sorts of money creating. They want to get people there. Now, if you were doing a privacy impact assessment on your free urban Wi-Fi, you would be thinking about things like, who is our vendor? And where is our vendor going to store the personal information of the community? And is there a way of allowing the community to log on to the free urban Wi-Fi without providing an extraordinary amount of personal information, right? So, some free urban Wi-Fis ask people to log on using their social media, right? I wouldn't recommend this. If I saw this in a privacy impact assessment, I would say, is there another way of doing this that provides the council with less information about a person and conversely provides the social media provider with less information about the person? So it's the idea that you are checking through your privacy lens and the rules in relation to collection and use and disclosure and storage and security of personal information, checking against those things to make sure that what you're doing supports your objective, is not excessive for your objective, and ultimately, from a privacy perspective, serves the community in the best possible way.
And then one final question. Do you have any thoughts on the implementation of the new ISO? What is it, 31,000?
The privacy by design.
Yeah.
Well, so this is really interesting, right? Because as with all standards, they allow us to create processes or engage in activities that support our compliance with the law. So a standard itself isn't the law. It is a tool that you use in order to support your compliance. Now, I would say if there are standards at your disposal that you think going through the process of implementing would help you comply with the privacy rules that apply to you, I think you should do it. The interesting thing about the privacy by design standard is perhaps it makes the concepts that were proposed in those 7 foundational principles of privacy by design more digestible and more doable in terms of action and process and assurance for a council. So look, my thoughts are do it if you can, knowing though that even attempting to do is better than doing nothing at all. Right. So if you don't think you can fully implement the standard, but you give it a red hot go and you keep accurate records of that and your work in that space, that's going to put you further ahead than other councils.
Thank you, Nicole. I think if there are no more questions, we can leave it there. A big thank you to everyone that's joined us and for spending your lunch break with us. We will circulate Nicole's slides as well as the book that she mentioned. The Strategic Privacy by Design book. We'll send a link around, and I'll share some information about Nicole if you'd like to reach out to her on LinkedIn or get in touch with IIS. Thank you everyone for joining. Thanks, Nicole.